All right, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We're all about getting you up to speed quickly on those topics that really matter.
That's right. You want to be in the know, right?
Absolutely. And today, well, today's dive is into a story that's been, I think it's fair to say, often overlooked, even buried a bit. The history of African and Caribbean people in Britain.
Yeah, and forget those little snippets you might have picked up here and there. We're talking way, way back.
Well, further back than most people would even guess. So, if you think you know this history, you might be in for some serious surprises. We're going deep. We're aiming for that real understanding, not just the surface stuff. And to help us navigate this, we've got an incredible resource.
Yeah, we're using Hakim Adi's book as our base camp, you could say. It's called The History of African and Caribbean Communities in Britain.
This book, it's comprehensive, it's well-researched, and it's going to help us uncover some crucial insights, stuff that really challenges a lot of common assumptions.
Because, let's be honest, there are a lot of misconceptions floating around out there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So our mission today, it's pretty straightforward but powerful. We're going to dismantle, completely take apart this myth that Black history in Britain is a recent thing, something that just popped up, you know.
Right, like it's just a new chapter, when in reality...
When in reality, it's woven into the very fabric of the nation.
Exactly, and we're talking centuries, not just decades. Deep, intricate connections that have shaped Britain in profound ways.
We're going to explore key periods,
Yeah.
introduce you to some remarkable individuals, and identify the major themes that really jump out from this rich, vibrant history.
And through Adi's research, we can move beyond those, surface-level narratives and truly grasp the lasting impact these communities have had on shaping Britain itself.
Just get ready for some serious perspective shifts.
Yeah.
Like, did you know that African people were living and working in Roman Britain?
Yeah, it's not something you hear every day, is it?
Not at all. It's just one of the many surprising things we'll be uncovering today.
It's fascinating, right? The layers of history that are often hidden.
Okay, let's start with something a lot of people think they know. That whole idea that Black people only arrived in Britain fairly recently, maybe with the Windrush generation in 1948.
Right, that's the common narrative. But Adi's book, it takes that narrative and just flips it on its head. He lays out such compelling evidence for a history that stretches back centuries, literally centuries.
Not just a few scattered instances either, a sustained, continuous presence.
Absolutely. We're talking about an integral part of the story of Britain, not some add-on at the end.
Exactly. And it starts way back, even in Roman Britain. Think about it. Roman Britain wasn't just about those Roman legions marching around.
Right. You had all kinds of people living there, contributing to society.
And, Adi points out, there were African soldiers stationed there. It wasn't just a Roman thing. It suggests, a far more integrated early British society than we usually imagine.
It makes perfect sense when you think about it. The Roman Empire was huge, drawing people from all its territories.
Right. They weren't just conquering places. They were incorporating them, in a way.
Exactly. And North Africa was a key part of that. Adi digs into archaeological evidence, too. Stuff like burial records, inscriptions.
Things that clearly identify individuals of African origin right there in Roman settlements in Britain.
It's amazing when you start piecing it together. And don't forget, there was even a Roman emperor who died in York, Septimius Severus.
Yeah, and guess what? He had African origins.
It really makes you rethink what you thought you knew about early Britain, doesn't it?
Big time. And it didn't stop with the Romans. This presence, this connection continued. Fast forward to the 1500s, the Tudor period, right?
Mm-hmm.
Adi's book talks about Black Tudors who were integrated into English society, which, again, isn't the image that most people have, is it?
No, not at all. And the very term Black Tudors is significant, right? It shows they were recognized as a distinct group within society.
Not just on the margins, either. These individuals were part of the working population, even within royal households.
Imagine that.
It just blows apart those later narratives of total racial segregation, Shows that early modern Britain was way more fluid and complex than we tend to assume.
Yeah, it wasn't so black and white, so to speak.
And it gets even more interesting. The book also highlights how, when those famous British explorers like Sir Francis Drake set off on their voyages, they had African explorers sailing with them.
Think about that. It really underscores how interconnected global exploration was back then. It wasn't just Europeans venturing out. It was a collaborative effort in many ways.
And African individuals. They had valuable maritime knowledge, skills that contributed to those expeditions. They weren't just along for the ride.
Right, their expertise was vital. It completely challenges the image of European exploration as this solely European endeavor.
It does. And this just reinforces the point. We're not talking about a recent arrival story. We're talking about long-standing presence, about significant contributions that go way back.
Exactly. And it just keeps going. Britain has always been a much more diverse place than some accounts would have you believe.
Way more diverse. Now, Adi's book doesn't just give us these broad historical strokes, does it? It also brings this history to life through the stories of these remarkable individuals, people who played key roles across different eras.
Right. These personal narratives, they offer a much deeper, more nuanced understanding of what it meant to be African or Caribbean in Britain throughout the centuries. And there's no better place to start than with Olaudah Equiano in the 1700s.
A truly remarkable man. Born in Africa, he was kidnapped, enslaved, and yet ultimately he achieved his freedom.
And he didn't stop there. He went on to write his autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, which was published in 1789.
Talk about impact. That book, it was monumental.
Absolutely. What's really striking is Equiano's agency, his sheer determination to share his story, to make people listen.
And people did listen.
Yeah.
It became such a crucial weapon in the fight against slavery.
Absolutely. It helped people understand the horrors of the slave trade on a very personal level. It wasn't just statistics, it was real human suffering.
And it's all thanks to Equiano's voice, to his willingness to speak out.
Exactly. And he didn't just write about it, he became a leading figure in the abolitionist movement in London. He worked tirelessly to dismantle that inhumane system.
Just a powerful example of how one person's story can spark real change, right?
Absolutely. And then we have another extraordinary individual from the 1700s, Phyllis Wheatley. A very different journey, but just as impactful.
Absolutely. Phyllis Wheatley, she was taken from Africa, enslaved in Boston, North America, and her story, it really highlights the intellectual capabilities that were just completely dismissed, denied to people of African descent.
Right. But her owners, they recognized her intelligence and they actually gave her an education. And, that opened up incredible doors for her.
And led to an astonishing achievement. In 1773, she became the first African-American woman to publish a book of poetry. Think about the societal barriers she had to overcome to do that.
Incredible, isn't it? And her poetry. It gained widespread acclaim. It really showcased the intellectual and artistic talents of African people, and it directly challenged those deeply ingrained racist beliefs of that era.
Directly challenged them. Then we move into the 1800s and we meet William Cuff.
Now, Cuffy's story takes us into the heart of the political struggles of his time in Britain. He was a leader in the Chartist movement. Now, for those who might not know, the Chartists, they were fighting for the rights of working-class people. They were pushing for huge reforms like universal male suffrage, the right for all men to vote.
So he was deeply involved in pushing for more democracy, more representation for everyday people.
Exactly. And what makes Cuffy's story so compelling is that he faced, immense racial prejudice while simultaneously advocating for the rights of all workers. Didn't matter their background. He was a powerful voice for fairness, for equality across the board.
And then we jump to the 20th century. We have Larry Constantine, a name that a lot of people might recognize from the world of sports.
Yeah, Larry Constantine was a truly gifted cricket player from Trinidad. He came to Britain and he achieved huge success, but his influence went way beyond the cricket pitch.
Way beyond. Adi's book really sheds light on his activism, his outspoken campaigning against racism and discrimination in Britain. He used his platform to call out injustice.
He didn't shy away from the tough topics, did he? And he fought for equality, both on and off the field.
He didn't. And his contributions, well, they were recognized in a huge way. He became the first black person to be made a lord in Britain. Just think about the significance of that.
It was a landmark moment. It really highlighted the impact he had on British society, his tireless work for equality. And, these individuals we've talked about, spanning centuries and coming from such different walks of life.
It just paints this picture that's so much richer, so much more complex than the simple recent arrival narrative.
Doesn't it? It forces you to reconsider what you thought you knew about who has been an integral part of British history, and for how long.
It really does. Now, the book also, it sort of organizes this vast history into these key periods, right?
It does. It takes us on a chronological journey, starting with that era long before the Windrush, which we've already touched on. It's important to emphasize just how deep that early presence goes.
So just to be clear, we're talking about this continuous connection from Roman times through the Black Tudors to the African explorers who sailed with the likes of Drake. These weren't isolated blips. They were part of the fabric of life, even if it was often marginalized.
Exactly, a consistent presence. And then the book delves into a really difficult period, the era of slavery, stretching from the 1600s to the 1800s.
A period that really forces us to confront Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade.
A role that was absolutely central and incredibly damaging. It involved the forced removal and the brutal exploitation of millions of African people in the Americas and the Caribbean.
A truly horrific chapter in history.
And Adi doesn't shy away from the fact that enslaved people were brought to Britain itself. Not on the same scale as the colonies, but their presence here. It's a part of that painful history.
A part that's often forgotten, unfortunately.
But alongside that horror, it's equally important to acknowledge the resistance, the constant, courageous fight for freedom by enslaved Africans and Caribbeans.
Imagine the strength it took to resist under those conditions.
It's truly inspiring. Then we move into the 20th century to the post-World War II era.
A time of rebuilding, a time of change. And that's when we see the arrival of the Windrush generation, people who were invited to help rebuild Britain after the war.
They played an absolutely vital role in the recovery effort, and their contributions to British society, they're immeasurable.
But as the book makes clear, these individuals and other Black residents already living in Britain, they faced huge challenges. Racism, unfair treatment.
Sadly, it was very much present. But despite that, these communities, they organized, they fought for their rights, for equality.
And those efforts, they laid the groundwork for so many of the anti-racist movements we see today.
It's all connected, isn't it?
Absolutely. The fight for racial justice, it has deep roots.
And those roots are explored in this book. It shows how those struggles are still relevant, still important, like the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a continuation of that long fight for equality.
So what are some of the main takeaways here? What are those big overarching ideas that Adi's book really drives home?
There are several. Firstly, it just completely dismantles that simplistic timeline, that idea that the African and Caribbean presence in Britain is a recent thing.
It's not a new chapter. It's woven into the entire story.
Exactly. Secondly, it emphasizes the absolutely crucial role that African and Caribbean people have played in building Britain, in its culture, its economy, its social and political life. They've made significant contributions that are often overlooked.
So recognizing those contributions, that's key.
Absolutely. And then there's the theme of the struggle for equality and justice. That runs through the entire book. The racism, the discrimination, the fight for equal rights.
It's a reminder that that fight is ongoing, right? It's
Right.
not something that just happened in the past.
Exactly. And finally, the book highlights the incredible resilience of African and Caribbean communities in Britain. In the face of adversity, they've shown incredible strength, determination, they've supported each other, they've worked for change.
It's truly inspiring testament to the human spirit.
It is.
Now, for listeners who are totally hooked and want to learn more, what are some other resources you'd recommend? What can people check out?
Oh, there are some fantastic books out there. For younger readers, there's Black and British, an illustrated history by David Olusoga, Jake Alexander, and Melanie Taylor. It's a really visually engaging book that makes this history accessible.
Perfect for getting younger generations interested, right?
Exactly. And for a personal perspective on the Windrush experience, there's Coming to England by Baroness Floella Benjamin and Diane Ewan. It's a powerful memoir.
Those firsthand accounts are so important.
They are. And Benjamin Zephaniah's Windrush Child is another great one. It tells the story of the Windrush journey through poetry.
Wow, that's an interesting approach.
It is. And then you've got Bright Stars of Black British History by J.T. Williams and Angela Vives. It's full of inspiring stories about Black British figures who made significant contributions in all sorts of fields.
Sounds like a great one.
And for a more concise overview, there's David Olusoga's Black and British, a short, essential history. It's really accessible for older readers.
Fantastic. So many great resources to explore. And before we wrap up, let's take a moment to talk about the author of the book we've been focusing on, Hakim Adi.
Hakim Adi is a leading historian who specializes in the history of Africa and the African diaspora. That refers to communities of African descent all over the world. His work has really helped to shine a light on this crucial aspect of history.
And his background is quite significant, isn't it?
It is. He's the first historian of African heritage to become a professor of history in Britain. That really speaks volumes about his expertise and the importance of his work.
It does. So to bring all of this together, what's the key takeaway for our listeners today?
I think the main message is this. The history of African and Caribbean people in Britain isn't a side story. It's not a footnote. It's a fundamental, integral part of British history.
It's essential to understanding who we are as a nation.
Exactly. And understanding this history, this richer, more complete history, it's so important for moving forward, for building a future that's truly based on fairness, on equality, on respect for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. So as you go about your day, think about this. How does knowing this history, this deeper history, change your view of British identity? How does it affect how you see the conversations happening today about race and belonging?
It's something to really reflect on, isn't it?
It is. And maybe, just maybe, take a moment to think about which part of this history surprised you the most and what that surprise tells you about the stories we're usually told. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.